Hello, it's now 7 o'clock, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the second installment of our faculty speaker series, In the Weeds, the Future of Cannabis in America. I'm Professor Daniel Barnhizer, and I'm excited to be moderating this conversation tonight with the immensely talented alumni we've gathered here. I also think, and I hope, that there might be a few prospective students in our midst, so that I'd really just like to welcome them to our conversation and encourage them to reach out to us. With such an interesting topic on our docket, I know we're going to need every minute of our hour together, so I'm going to provide just a brief introduction and turn it over to the speakers. So our speakers tonight, David M. Revore is an adjunct professor at Michigan State University College of Law, where he teaches 2 marijuana law courses. Revore also serves as city attorney and general legal counsel and special counsel to a number of Michigan cities, townships, and municipal authorities. Representing cities and townships in crafting local ordinances to permit the location of cannabis operations, Revore works weekly with large and mid-sized cannabis developers to locate in mid-Michigan and other developing areas, as well as providing legal counsel and consulting services to other law firms and consulting firms. Myles Baker is the Director of Legal and Regulatory Compliance for multi-state operator Pleasantries Cannabis Company. Myles's primary focus is to guide Pleasantries through the complex regulatory scheme that governs the cannabis industry. Finally, Jerome Crawford is the Director of Legal Operations and Social Equity for Pleasantries, Michigan's premier cultivator and seller of high-quality Midwest cannabis. He is in a unique hybrid role. The impact of the war on drugs didn't happen overnight, and therefore righting the wrongs of the past will take time. It's a good thing he's entered the fight. This trailblazing young attorney was the first Black in-house counsel of a major cannabis manufacturer in the state of Michigan, and among a myriad of other functions, leads initiatives to eliminate historic cultural stigma around the cannabis industry and make Pleasantries a good neighbor in the communities it serves. On behalf of Michigan State University College of Law and our community, thank you all for being here. I will turn over the program to David Revore, who will kick off the program for us tonight.
Thank you, Professor Barnheiser. One thing I'd like to mention is that all 3 of the panelists are MSU Law alumni, right? So it's great to be back. As we were preparing for this, we were thinking, okay, we're going to have a really good, diverse group of attendees, but not everybody has the same knowledge of cannabis, the laws, what's on the horizon, where we came from, where we're at, where we're going. So, we have a brief amount of time to try to just really have a great conversation with some of the things that we're encountering in the world from our perspective practices and what we do for our vocations. And so as we put together some topic notes, we thought, okay, where is it going? And one of the things that confronts me as a municipal attorney, a city attorney, is working with cannabis developers. And that's what I consider Myles and Jerome, and what they do is they're cannabis developers. Okay, they're developing an industry out there, and how do we get that industry in Michigan to the point where it is just the industry that we know it's going to become. And we look at some of the passages of the laws of Medical Marijuana Act of 2008. And then 2016, the Michigan Medical Facilities Licensing Act that brought in the commercial licensing of these, and then MARTMA, Michigan Regulation and Taxation. And so we're now at the point where we're seeing good growth on growing and processing. But one of the things that we're dealing with in the municipal world is trying to bring the retail in a viable marketplace. So we have some major cities that have a lot of retail outlets, and then some of the mid-sized cities that are just kind of stepping into it with grow and processing, but yet don't have the retail yet. So as we were kind of developing our 420 today, we're thinking, hey, what's some of the things that we're looking at in terms of developing access? And so, there's I would encourage the attendees to take some notes and jot down some websites. Being the Cannabis Regulatory Agency of Michigan has the laws there, and I would direct you to that website. The Cannabis Regulatory Agency for Michigan, and take a look at the laws. But one of the things I wanted to focus on, at least for the first part of our conversation tonight, is retail outlets. Okay, so we're seeing the grows, we're seeing the processing, and we're seeing it. It almost seems like the retail outlets are concentrated towards the bigger cities, not quite the mid-sized cities. And Jerome and Myles, they have an expertise in that area as well. But and they're free to, as with all of our topics tonight, we're gonna touch on some things with the retail. We're gonna talk about some compliance issues, labor and employment, social equity, and some of those things that are coming up, and also federal deregulation, descheduling, decriminalization, and some legal careers. So we've got some really good points that we're going to try to address tonight in the time in which we have. One of the challenges we have from the municipal world is where to site these at. The local business districts, the commercial districts, the freeway districts and things like that. And one of the concepts that I'm working on with my attorney group in my municipalities we represent is what we call a cannabis retail overlay district, or cannabis retail district that is a location that rehabs certain areas within the cities or the townships that we can, have this overlay and not be held to certain ordinances and zoning ordinances, things like that. So one of the things that we're trying to do is say, okay, this is going to work. How can it work? Where can it work? Can we rehab some properties? What's the value to the municipality? And so oftentimes when I'm working with the cannabis developers, some of them are highly sophisticated. They come with an advanced team and they know their clients. Some are in-house, some work for firms, but the serious cannabis developers will come to my municipality. This is what we're looking at. This is what we would like to do. And so some of the practice tips that we've been talking about is, if you're going into the law and you're going to represent cannabis, know your client. What do they do? Okay. Jerome and Myles will talk about knowing their client. They were in other areas of law. They went to work in-house. They know their client. Okay. They've developed goals. They have things that they want to do. Jerome, Myles, your thoughts on that?
There's one on the knowing your client, and part about knowing your client. And thank everybody for joining us for this special webinar on 420 itself. So we're into the weeds and talking about the weeds at the exact same time. So there's one important nugget that I definitely would like to share, and that actually relates to the sort of the legal backdrop, if you will. I think by that I mean the legal backdrop for marijuana laws in the state of Michigan. The reason we're talking about municipalities, and from what David's sharing, I'm thinking about from a zoning perspective. So zoning is super important because ultimately zoning determines where that business activity can actually be, right? Where can it actually exist? And it's going to govern every part of activity. The other part about the law that people don't always appreciate is people think, well, marijuana was legalized in our state, say from a use standpoint and for the ability for business activities. Well, every state in the world of cannabis, I think it's important that we have all this foundation that we're thinking about is like its own island. And then within that state, particularly say in Michigan, every city is like its own Vatican City. It's its own little petri dish of legalized activity. So you have to understand that that's why when Dave was going in depth about what's allowed in one municipality, it really matters. By way of a certain quick example, we have another operator in the exact same city that we're in. They're dealing with a challenge where marijuana business was legalized from where they are in their state. Unfortunately, their parking lot falls in, their city that they're in, their parking lot falls in a different city altogether. So it's made it incredibly difficult for them to pave their own parking lot. So know your client and know their industry. And part of knowing a cannabis client, know that they just have very unique and difficult regulatory regime that they have to sort of battle and fight their way through.
I'll hop in with my 2 cents on the topic. I say that a ton of it is zoning, and zoning is everything. And knowing your client involves knowing their operation. As David said, zoning matters. So a lot of those operators, depending on what their specialty is, kind of determines where they will seek to be zoned. So as a vertical operator like Pleasantries, our processors and grows often fall in industrial neighborhoods or zoning, because that's kind of where the facilities tend to lead to those, kind of favor those operations. And then retail often tries to fall into like a general business district or something that's an overlay. So depending on your next build out, you got to become a master of that city zoning ordinance. And that's something that they often lean on for their in-house counsel. That's also often the same ordinance that will give you your licensing or your application. A ton of that falls into zoning and setbacks from other operators. So zoning is key in looking to place your operation and knowing what you're looking for from an operation standpoint will, I guess, dictate your zoning.
When we look at these laws, the MMFLA, they allow for 5 different licenses. And to locate those licenses in the municipality, that local municipality, be it a city, a village, or a township, must pass an ordinance to allow those to locate in their jurisdiction. Now, under MARTMA, the municipality can choose what licenses to allow in or none at all. And so, part of the discussion tonight, we're talking about retail. So there's a provisioning center under the MMFLA, and then there's the retail establishment under MARTMA. But some jurisdictions that may have provisioning center for retail sales under one law may not have it for the other one for whatever reason. And so when I work with these developers, I'm talking to them like, okay, well, we may have grow or process or retail, but what is your plan? What is your thoughts? Because some of my jurisdictions just have grow, some just have process, some have grow, process, retail, however they want to do it. But it's working with the developers, looking at those 2 laws, those primary laws, the MMFLA and MARTMA, and talking to the developers and saying, what is your goal? What is your intent? Where do you want to be? And then pulling out the zoning district map, right? That matches up with the ordinance, and actually doing what I call, and when I talk to the developers, who's your advanced team? Have you been there? Have you gone online? Have you looked at and see what kind of ordinances are already online with the jurisdiction? Have you gone to the Cannabis Regulatory Agency that has the jurisdictions online and what they have and what they may not have, right? And as they develop their program to make their introduction to a city council, a township board, city manager, township manager, the municipal attorney, whatever else, as a practice tip, I talk to the developers and say, put your advanced team on the ground, look at the online ordinances, what they have, because ordinances fall under the heading of death, taxes, and the law will change, right? So the law is the ordinances in the local jurisdictions, and we will craft the ordinances and then we amend the ordinances, because it is a rapid industry, as I've told my students from time to time, and you have got to be reactionary if you want to be a participant, if you want to be not only in the room, but in the table.
David, question is, and I think it's a question I'm posing because we know the answer already. Is it very easy to keep track of every city's ordinances? They're just like one website that spit all the information to me, or do I have to diligently watch each of these municipalities, which have their own processes for how they enact the ordinances, where they promulgate them online, print, what's that process?
Well, I was, Jerome, you and I were both at the State Bar Cannabis Conference, right? In Mount Pleasant here this last fall. And there's actually a vendor out there that tracks all the ordinances in all the states that have it. And I don't have that card with me, but there is a commercial vendor that tracks all the ordinances of each municipality and what they have. Okay. So there is that service out there.
I think it might have been Philo. It might have been the one, or Philo or Philo, F-Y-L-L-O.
It may have been.
Taking note. But there are some other providers to David's point.
They acquired Cannabis
out there.
Yep.
And
another thing is, we're not going to do screen sharing tonight because of our limited time, but go to the Cannabis Regulatory Agency, surf their website, because they actually have weed type maps that will show you the jurisdiction and all the ordinances they have there. So when I talk to developers, and again, we work with other law firms that represent the developers in some areas. And what we've done is, hey, pull that map out. What's your vision? What's your growth plan? Look at the jurisdiction, go to the CRA, Cannabis Regulatory Agency, pull up and see what ordinances they already have. Go to the website of the jurisdiction and actually get that ordinance, because that will show you the zoning districts of what's allowed and what's not. Now, sometimes if a developer wants something in a certain area and the ordinance doesn't allow for it, well, then, that's more work for the municipal attorneys, right? To figure that out, work with the governing elected body, the city council, township board, and determine if that's something that they want. And if they do, and if they're already into the industry, then we start working on how that can happen.
Yeah,
But
with that, you also get into, I say our development team is just as important as running an application, because often you're running a special land use permit almost simultaneously to your cannabis application. So you're looking for those green zones, determining if you need a special land use permit based on that city zoning ordinance. And sometimes you're duplicating application information so that the city building department knows what's being built and can issue that permit, simultaneous with the actual operator or cannabis permit.
Yeah, one of the things that I encounter is they'll make the application. They'll have to produce their site plan so that it comports with the zoning. An SLU, special land use permit for any cannabis operation. And that also looks like an agreement. It's not only an SLU, but it's an agreement of what the developer will do. Okay, so there's a number of things to go through there. It's not insurmountable, but it is a plan. It is a system. And I've noticed that the very sophisticated developers, cannabis groups out there know this. They're putting together their advanced teams. And now, what I see is more of a barrier in some of the municipalities going from grow, process to retail. And I think that's more plausible and much more acceptable when they're dealing with professional cannabis developers that already have their plan together and know how to work with the municipalities. Hey, we've got this question I get is, why would a municipality want retail if they don't already have it? And you know what? I know we've got some great comments here on the financial benefits for a municipality to go retail, right? Jerome, Myles, you've got some good information on that.
Sure, happy to share. I'll kick off a few, and Myles can take us home. So part of what we do is candidly is a little bit of courting you find yourself doing, right? Where each of these cities are going to enact a new law. Well, who you want to do? You want to meet the people who are going to be the decision makers. You want to meet the elected officials that actually support the legislation in the first place, because you need those laws to exist to have a chance to survive, right? There's and at least in our eyes, is making sure we put our money and our work where our mouth is, but there's certain commitments that you make to these cities to come in. So from a social equity standpoint, right, you might be saying, here are the different hiring targeted efforts we're going to have when we come in to make sure we hire from people that are from disproportionately impacted backgrounds, things like that. But in making all of those pledges, if you will, at times, which, we try to do a point of making sure we honor that. I think there's the operators in our industry sometimes have a poor reputation of not following through. There's another very clear benefit that municipalities get. I think that really helps convince them that even if maybe on the fence about this, we know that voters in our city maybe were not as pro legalization, you can't ignore the financial benefits. The number that I believe was just recently distributed, Myles, correct me if I'm wrong, was just over $42 million that was ultimately distributed among the 163 or so municipalities and counties that are a part of MERTMA right now. That's about $56,000, and that number likely will increase over time. And where does that come from? That's definitely fees and things that charge we have to pay that works its way back into that pool and then gets distributed to those cities. By way of example, I believe it was Washtenaw County got 1.8 million alone of that. Of Washtenaw County, Ann Arbor took 1.4 million of it. So naturally, I mentioned us having relationships that you have with elected officials and city government. A lot of things we tell them is, when they say all these things and we need money for to do, right? The city of Pontiac, for better or worse, has a really drawn out process, almost 2 years long. They're licensing and they're just not hitting the final appeals process. And we were having a chat, with the mayor recently. He's meeting different operators, and they're like talking about things they want to do. And when this email dropped, we just forwarded the email. So hey, that's the type of benefit that could definitely work its way right into the city, and that's nothing that's got to do with us personally. That's just by being a participant as a city.
And then add in some more detail to Rome's numbers, which were spot on, by the way. Those revenues come from 374 licensees across the state. And part of MERTMA includes a 10% excise tax, which over the fiscal year 2021 gathered $111 million from that 10% of sales made. So it generates a ton of money for collections and tax, and then that money gets actually redistributed to those cities. Jerome says we often, interact with these municipalities, and we're very open to have people come and tour our facilities to show them our standard of operation. And I've heard municipalities saying, "Did you just hear about so-and-so getting an extra $57,000? Like these municipalities need that money, can use that money in their budget." And now I think it's becoming a thing that they realize they can actually generate revenue for their city themselves.
So when we look at the financial benefits, right? So the MMFLA and MARTMA provide $5,000 for a facility or a license per, right? So that is a fee, to offset some expenses. Then when we look at the buildings that are going up, that's taxable value that's going back into the taxing jurisdictions, the city or the township and the K-12 schools, the ISD, the libraries, things like that. So there's taxable value on the property. And what we were talking about today with some of these other statistics is that Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs on March 24th, 22 published some of these stats. And Jerome was right on, $42+ million among 163 municipalities. Keep in mind that money is divided up based on a portion of the retail or the micro businesses per jurisdiction. And so what came out was you can have, say, Acme Township that has 13 retail. Well, it's 56,000 plus for every one of them that jurisdiction has. So, and I'm saying Acme Township because I don't want to identify any of them, right? But Acme Township has 13 retail outlets. So 13 times 56,400 is actually what they got for just that portion. Now, if you have, Beta City out there that may have 60 retail outlets, that's going to be X times 56,000. So that is how that percentage is broken down. And those were just published again on March 24th. And I got to be very candid. Some of my clients were calling me up going, how fast can you start updating our ordinances, right? And I'm thinking, well, this is not a help wanted ad for the attendees, but I got to tell you, it's how do we put it, gentlemen? Pun intended, growing.
Very much
booming,
growing industry, right? We've planted the seeds and now we're watching them
cultivating opportunity.
Yeah. There you go.
So, but with that comes more regulation, right? So we were talking about some compliance issues in our kind of our pre-meetings that really, folks, are a lot of fun, but they're not recorded for you. Sorry about that, friends. But these gentlemen have some really great comments on some of the compliance issues that we were talking about, and let's kind of turn that over, move down that point if we can.
Yeah, I'll hop in on that. That kind of falls under my umbrella as the director of compliance, which is actually both very quasi business, but very legal, because now companies, or I guess state agencies, see those same opportunities to collect both permit fees, maybe violation fees. So every big boy state agency now is turning to cannabis as a very emerging industry that they can now kind of sink their regulatory teeth into. Just a few years ago, it was primarily what was the Bureau, then the MRA, and then as of last week, the CRA, the Cannabis Regulatory Agency, and that was renamed because they actually took over the hemp processing and licensing capabilities from MDARD. So now MDARD also still controls pesticide use and application, which again is very relevant to an agricultural field like growing cannabis, and has taken these opportunities to let the CRA settle in, let the operations in Michigan settle in, and then come in to begin their own inspections of, pesticide use, safe application of those pesticides. It's very agricultural, and all of those things touch plants and then therefore are still governed by MDARD. Along with that, Eagle. So they're obviously looking at the environmental impact of cannabis. There's wastewater runoff. There are emissions from facilities. I mean, there are all kind of environmental implications, to the point that we have very specific state waste plans on how you dispose of cannabis waste. These very specific entities are now taking these opportunities to come around, conduct these inspections, and add an additional regulatory layer on top of cannabis. If you think about it, there is the overall act, which are both MRTMA, MMFLA, and the MMMA. And then there's a more specific set of administrative rules that kind of fall under that. And those are those rule sets that govern, almost everything you do, down to employees of the cannabis industry. And now there's guidance being issued by almost all of these state agencies that say, hey, here's how we're going to step in and influence the cannabis industry as well. So that goes to MIOSHA, which is obviously influencing and implanting workplace safety restrictions, right? A lot of cannabis processors are actually very mechanical in nature, almost like a plant type job. And with that, there are workplace safety concerns with machines being used. And again, internal emissions. Like there's two divisions of MIOSHA. One is safety, and then there's labor, right? So it's like your labor protections, and then your actual workplace mechanical issues, right? There's health and there's safety. So those two are very much influenced by MIOSHA standards, although cannabis itself, the actual plant, is governed by the CRA. With that, the CRA conducts regular inspections of cannabis facilities. So that is another layer of specific guidance from the CRA, but doing your pre-licensure inspections, where they come out and check your facility to make sure it's reaching, safety and fire restrictions and actual operations on doors and locks and cameras and security. Those happen at pre-licensure, 30-day post-licensure, semi-annual, and then annual after that. So you really always have to be aware of these governing bodies and how they're going to affect your business or your client's business. And that is a way that you can insert yourself as, hey, I understand the rules. Everything that you need to do is guided by these rules, specifically from the CRA and these other state agencies. And by being a master in those areas of law, although not specifically related to cannabis, you can add value to these cannabis companies, as they have to understand that there's more than just the CRA governing those operations. So that's a place that attorneys, young or old, can add value to the cannabis space and really help new operators, experienced operators alike understand, what they've got to do to be compliant in a highly regulated field. I would say more highly regulated than gambling, certainly than alcohol. So from my perspective, we're operating in the most highly regulated field in America, and the rules do appear as such.
The rules reflect the same. And Myles, if I may, I want to, interesting point that you raised that speaks to the underlying notions that really guide and influence, for better or worse, how our legal cannabis industry operates. So in all the things that Myles mentioned about, you have these different regulatory regimes, there's different statutes that say what you have to do, what you don't have to do, and here's our regulator. Well, there's some undertones in some of those things. He mentioned disposal, right, of product. You would think that, I don't know, we happen to cultivate, we grow stuff, we put the best possible nutrients you can imagine, right? So this is better than Miracle-Gro, right? Wouldn't we have some awesome compost if we were able to actually take that and then, I don't know, maybe even donate it, right, to different agricultural operations, farming. And guess what? People would not get high, right? Because at that point, you're talking the stems where the THC content is virtually non-existent, has been totally extracted. And if you smoked an entire bag of those stems, you might get a bad headache, but you wouldn't get high. And challenging, though, what is that sustainability model, which seems so obvious, is the fact that we have something in the disposal realm where you're required to mix with your waste 50% plastic or cardboard. You have to render it unusable, essentially. So we, in an industry which blows my mind, could be so sustainable, right? Have the cyclicality that you need, right, to be sustainable like that. We're actually creating waste. we're putting that right in the landfills. It becomes useless material. So that's an example that it is highly regulated, and a ton of things have to happen from a compliance standpoint. But the way in which we actually get pushed there for certain things isn't necessarily always rooted in what makes sense or good reason. It's because they're underlying stigma, because kids are going to dump to dive and smoke. That's not what's going to happen. Myles,
Yeah,
there's some of the hot topics,
Eagle.
hot stuff you want to jump into, man, as
Yeah,
well.
I was going to say that
because I don't
with
want
the
to steal your
compost.
thunder on that.
No, you're good. With the compost aspect, they try to carve out a lane for it, but it's like you have to get a permit, and then Eagle has to bless this, and then it's got to go to an Eagle sanctioned cannabis compost facility. So it's just like that regulatory overlay just makes it harder and harder to do something that you almost feel would be obvious, or at least obviously helpful. And then with Rome's prompt, rolling over to these kind of hot topics and things that are just happening right now or just recently happened, is the CRA did a major rollout of updated edible packaging. This state or the country has seen an uptick of children or people under the age of 21 consuming edibles, whether mistaking them as candy or being left out by an adult, and have completely dropped new regulations on the fact that these things cannot be shaped like fruits, can't look like any of your traditional candies, can't have any cartoons or caricatures on the packaging. Kind of really toned it down to avoid that confusion. And if you've seen it like I have, they will try to recreate your favorite candy plus cannabis. And the CRA has cracked down on that greatly to avoid that confusion and kind of try to do their part of course, making it a little less appealing. Of course, the rules already state that all cannabis should be in child-resistant packaging, but sometimes that gets lost in translation, and or you got someone that's determined enough to get the package open if they think it's Sour Patch Kids. That's kind of something that the CRA has stepped in and is trying to do their part to limit.
David, I got a question for you on that one. I'm just curious. I imagine laws like that, or updates to the rules rather, frankly, make it a little bit easier appeal for certain cities and municipalities as well that may have those concerns, right? Because I know like some of the edible law changes, one of them was even like you can't even have animals. I believe that's right, Myles. So there's an edible manufacturer that has a very mature looking horse, right? Is its logo. It's not like a cartoon horse. It's actually kind of like a serious horse, right? They had to then get rid of the horse altogether and just use like shapes that didn't form an animal, because again, that major concern. But again, Dave, my thought is that again, rules like that are not always just because it makes sense. It's also to help reduce some of that stigma, right, and challenge for cities.
It does. And, some of the things that you gentlemen are talking about is, the regulation that you're dealing with from a cannabis developer side, right? And so you're working with the Cannabis Regulatory Agency, the state agency, on certain regulations and those layers and product development and THC, no appealing, packaging. And, I've met, through my various areas of law practice, have met law enforcement officials that have seized products that, they'll show you the product that's on the shelf that's non-THC, and then they've got the product next to it and they're taking these photos. Again, we're not doing any screen sharing tonight, but it's very difficult to tell the difference between these two products, right? So, when you start looking at some of the new regulations coming out of, or, enhanced regulations, maybe amended regulations coming out of the CRA, then we're starting to look at, okay, wow, we talked about compliance and layers of regulation. Well, now some of the more larger municipalities are employing full-time people to make sure that these regulations and the product developers are in compliance with those state regulations as well. So you're actually looking at 3 different types of legal positions there. 1 from the cannabis developer, 2 from the state regulatory agencies, right? And then you're looking at from the municipal regulation. And so when you start to kind of merge these together and start speaking a common language, it actually flows much better for the developers, the municipalities, and the state. And it also helps identify those illicit or illegal products that shouldn't be out there that are not tested anyway, which does pose a risk, in of itself.
You mean to tell me that runts with a Z is not another form of runts or nerds? All this time, I had no idea. Skittles with a Z is not normal Skittles.
Yeah, it is crazy, and they're good photos, but another day, right? So
another day. I'm going to merge this, Myles, into social equity. If there's anything else you want to cover on compliance, make sure we didn't jump on that part. But the reason I had that backdrop is because a big part of my position is this term called social equity. And a lot of people even ask, what is social equity? It's our term of art in our industry, candidly, for what we consider DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's because cannabis has a very well-known backdrop and a sordid history that is very complicated, that all of us have to, at a minimum, acknowledge. And then from there, what accountability should each of us take for that in our respective roles? And then what action do you go from there? So those 3 A's. To break that down, there's a really great example, and I give credit to it. Ankonet Sarfo, who some of you may know was an anchor, I believe, on Channel 2 some time ago, suffered from MS, and long story short, was one of the earliest advocates in our state for some of the marijuana reform. She herself found that cannabis use actually helped her with her condition. And she joined our podcast, and she said, what's social equity? She said, it's very simple. Give the people a cut. Social, people, equity, a cut. And I really resonated with me. I'll make sure I always give her credit. I told her, and anytime I share that, because that's the essence of social equity. It's in ensuring that the groups that were marginalized by the actual criminalization and prohibition centered around cannabis before it was a quote legalized industry, those individuals actually need the most help participating in the industry, right? The war on drugs, and so the purpose, if you will, of social equity, before getting the war on drugs, is ultimately to help bridge that gap. There's going to be a normal gap that would exist if you opened any new industry tomorrow. Those that are better well off, if you will, better resources, are able to participate. Well, that gap, which social economic status really can correlate and align with also races as well, minorities, it exacerbated that normal gap that would exist because those were the same folks that were over criminalized. The war on drugs is a term I think many have come to learn, to appreciate, think we know what it is. In some, the war on drugs is never really a war on people. War on drugs, it was a war on people in poverty. The war on drugs, so-called, has been very well documented through multiple administrations of our own country, that it was a tool, right? It wasn't the fact that the drugs were the issue, it was that the drugs, we can associate them with certain individuals that we, candidly, around the actual war that was existing in the Nixon administration, and they're on record saying this. Hey, they said, think the hippies and the black and brown folks, if we can keep them kind of quiet, right? Because they're the ones that don't like the war, right? Well, if we can use, these legal regimes centered around criminalization of this product and among other products, we can use that to break up their families, their homes, their organizations. It's literally on record. The irony of war on drugs is this, and if I asked for a show of hands, I wouldn't be surprised to see crickets or hear crickets if I said, how many of you knew that in early settlement Jamestown era days, that farmers are actually required to grow cannabis? Now, I learned that myself very recently from one of our colleagues, John Fraser, in the industry, turned out at Dykema, and he is the master story on this stuff. One thing I did know, especially when I entered this space, is that you could buy cannabis legally on the streets in the early 1900s. So those same tinctures that you see in stores now, literally advertised in the paper. Cannabis, right, or marijuana specifically is referred to then, right? And the reason that it adopted sort of the Spanish version of the name, like marijuana, right? The reason it's spelled that way, because it was meant to be associated with, again, certain groups of people. The initial regimes that were created around taxation and Marijuana Tax Stamp Act, then that sort of evolved its way into what we might think about mandatory minimums, houses actually being enforced. And it really was something that was used to ravage. So now that you legalize the industry, you snap your fingers, day one, here we are. Well, and I say this, as current operators, it's none of our fault, if you will, for what happened to the war on drugs, right? But we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge it's a benefit and a blessing to operate in this space, and that we carry that history with us, right? So our accountability may not come previous, our accountability starts now. If we want to be in this, we have to acknowledge that past and then actually do something about it. So as a company, we created, by way of example, a social equity plan, which is really just a way to kind of organize our work that we do. And we created under around 4 simple pillars. That was for us, access to the value chain, basis for us, jobs, low-hanging fruit, being intentional with your hiring, not just LinkedIn and Indeed. Education, so destigmatizing. The mere fact that Myles and I sit in these seats today is our version of destigmatizing and educating around the truth of not just the cannabis industry, but also cannabis users, right? That do not to be demonized. And After that portion, we have legislation and advocacy, which is what you see make the news a lot, right? So criminal justice reform, a lot of people hear about things like the MORE Act and descheduling, decriminalization. What does that do? Simply put, everybody that's in prison or jail or whatever should be let out yesterday, right? And then we can figure out the market side on the back end, but that's just a matter of course. And finally, being a good neighbor. We recognize that our presence, to David's points earlier about being in a municipality, we're representative, right? So what one of us does is going to be reflective upon all of us, especially if there's this historical stigma attached to actually what happens, you know, with respect to cannabis and to an operator. The last nuggets I'll note here, because I know we got a number of questions that we got early on. We're getting some in the chat, and I definitely want to give us some time to answer those. Actually, just relate to a sentiment I shared in actually an event I spoke on earlier is around drug testing, right? And the reason I use drug testing as an example, there's so many different ways I could illustrate this for you. I could talk about some of the license deals you're hearing right now, and everybody's probably heard about, oh man, Allen Iverson and Ben Wallace got their weed now, and that's the version of social equity, right? They're getting their cut. Maybe, right? It's how some of the hypocrisy that is attached into our workplace policies, right? And what you're seeing now is, as employers, we have an absolute requirement that we actually have to do something about how we're going to test for drugs, not test for drugs, and really asking ourselves as employers the why behind it. There's always been a why, right, attached to it, and I think that's the meaning of social equity, is to help educate and to break down some of those historical stereotypes and ask yourself, why did I never like cannabis? Why was weed always a bad thing for me, for my family, right? And you realize that a lot of it is actually rooted in sentiment, and the propaganda machine is powerful, particularly when our own government is behind it, right? It's an incredible ability to make you think something is inherently wrong, and then maybe never it was. But if you've ravaged homes, communities, generations were affected, somebody's uncle and grandfather, brother, or son was actually incarcerated for it. And yeah, you're right. It's going to feel like a bad thing inherently. So with that, I want to give a chance to transition some questions. We got a ton more, I think, in our outline we would love to talk about, but we know it's just not possible. So Dan, I'm going to kick it to you, and let's see what we got on deck.
I'm just going to say that was fantastic. That was one of the most conversational and informative discussions I've seen in a webinar and on this topic or not. Thank you all very much. I'm really honored to be able to act as the moderator for this. And you know, we do have a number of questions. I'm going to lead off with really one dealing with Michigan specifically. What's the outlook for Michigan's cannabis market if interstate commerce of cannabis is no longer illegal? What if we have to compete with other states? How well is Michigan set up to be able to take on producers in California, Washington, and now New York as it moves into its full production and regime, and you know, a host of other states?
I'll hop in first on this one just because it's something that I kind of think about, and I think we all think about pretty often. I think right now, Michigan is situated as a top 5 producer and seller of cannabis in the country, right? So we're in a great place as we sit here today with just over half of the states offering some version of legal cultivation of cannabis, whether that's medical or recreational, that at least gives you a safe space to grow this cannabis, right? And then I saw something comparing Michigan and other states just based off weather alone, right? You think about a ton of Michigan cultivators are in indoor facilities, not your greenhouse type facility. So you're using money to keep the lights on, keep things at the correct temperature. I heard in an article that both Colorado and California receive about 340 days a year of sunshine, right? So they can take advantage of those outdoor cultivation facilities or even greenhouse facilities to have a massive square footage and actually keep energy costs down. With that noted, I don't know how that positions Michigan in a regime where things can be transported, maybe using Amazon if it's not a Schedule I drug or federally illegal, to pick things up in California and 2 days ship them to Michigan, right? California doing the same. So those states that can reduce their energy and produce at a high level and quality level will then rise to the top. Like even if you're thinking about southern states, like maybe Florida's wet, warm, and sticky, and that is conducive, although right now they have some of the most strict cannabis laws you can find because that's their political landscape. Once that federal kind of rollback happens, maybe some things by nature of where they sit, like those outdoor sports are looking real good in Florida and Texas because the weather's good for it. That could be the same for cannabis. And then things will kind of regionally, like wine, like cherries, like anything else, gravitate towards certain regions. So I think a federal rollback actually changes things a lot and would make it a very interesting cross or interstate commerce.
One of the things that I've in conversation with cannabis developers, the cannabis that's grown outside is going towards different products than the cannabis that's grown inside. And one of the concerns with the outdoor grow is cross-pollination and things like that, that's actually disturbing the scientific R&D of the indoor grow. So some of it has to do with like product driven on outdoor versus indoor grow of cannabis. And I think it's like anything else. It's kind of a supply and demand. If you have a, I like certain wines I don't like, right? So I think a lot of that is going to be driven by, the consumer and what they want. But I think Michigan is well positioned because Michigan has, comparatively speaking with other states, a rather experienced regulatory and state regime. We're not really getting into how to decriminalize the process of that at the federal level, but if it were and they left it up to the states, I think Michigan is well positioned to have an experienced regulatory system that, that experienced developers like yourselves and others out there know how to work with this. And so when you look at where Michigan is positioned in the United States, some of the states are not, they don't even have medical, or they're just CBD states. So I think, there's always that abundance coming from the West Coast, but that's going to come in illegally or lawfully, however it comes in anyway. And so if the state barriers are broken down, I think talking to some of the developers I've talked to, and some of them are out of state, coming into Michigan, some of the I don't want to name them, but some of the multi-state developers, they're already looking forward to, at some point in time, decriminalization or descheduling, and how are they going to expand their product line. And you walk into a fine wine store, right, and you're going to have a lot of different wine on the walls, just like you walk into a great cannabis store. You're going to see a lot of different strains or products or things like that. I think it's going to be consumer driven, and I think the best will be.
I do agree with that. And I do think that Michigan is a Midwestern powerhouse. Like if you're putting our region in a north to south vertical, I think Michigan is definitely well suited to be able to operate or distribute to its neighboring states, specifically Ohio and Indiana, that have either very restricted or no action at all. So that's interesting.
And I think from a standpoint of the regulated market that we have in Michigan, there's a lot of compliments in terms of how that market is maturing or trying to, but I think we're still on the tip of the iceberg for the legitimate market that's out there. You may see grows here and retail there, but when you look at that in comparison to, as you described, the vertical Michigan and then going down to the southern states, there's a lot of room to expand in Michigan, and again, well positioned in the United States to be that powerhouse you've described, Myles.
And I guess I'll jump in here with another one related to trade. You mentioned that Michigan is well situated in terms of actual transport and possibly also growing varietals that are better here than anywhere else. We also have someone next door to the north that likes weed. Is there any discussion of the possibility of international trade? I know that Canada has had sort of fits and starts in some of its experience with its cannabis industry. Are any of the panelists aware of any discussions of possibilities of international trade?
So I'm not aware of the specific discussions. I am aware of the prerequisite though, and that is us as the United States. We're the holdup, right? And our friends to the north, as you said, they figured it out, and they're like, to the point that they are buying our companies and putting them on the Canadian Stock Exchange and saying, hey, whenever you're ready, United States, just come on and catch up over here, right? And the irony of that is that they're taking our sophistication, they're taking our techniques that we're mastering and just buying them. And naturally, companies here are like, heck yeah, how much? Where do I sign? Of course, right? You're gonna infuse capital into me from outside wherever. Great, I'd love to do that. So we're the holdup, and it's gonna take us, I think, as a country, figuring it out first. Again, mention the MORE Act, and it's got its tentacles to it. There's other legislations being proposed. I think the biggest challenge with these bills that we see at our federal level is that they're kitchen sink bills, and they're trying to put everything in to make everybody happy. And if you get enough people that are not happy, guess what doesn't pass? And instead, maybe they could piecemeal. What do we all agree on? Such as, I mean, you have your social justice advocates that are saying, well, we got to get the stuff we want to deschedule and decriminalize. Just start there, because we generally all agree on that. If we start with that type of stuff and eliminate, then it puts us in a better position, right? To be prepared, right, for sort of what's coming next.
I think without being hyper technical, the key to the descheduling, decriminalization is probably going to be the pathway through Congress. If you go to the USAG and all the hearings, and as much as we respect the AG and the DEA and all those governmental agencies, that's going to be very time consuming. Whereas Congress can pass the acts and then do it from that standpoint. So to Jerome's point, deschedule it, change the laws that will allow that, and then we have the treaty issues between our friends to the north. Canada is the first North American country to go recreational, right, with a population north of 34 million, and so they're well positioned. And you know what, Michigan is well positioned for Canada, so that's another I think a benefit of Michigan versus a state that's in the center of the United States, right? We have what we call logistics and things to know that without a crystal ball, I think we're sooner than later, closer to that endpoint, especially when you see the groundswell of all the other states that are at least medical going into recreational. And if the path is through Congress, then you're starting to see more and more of acceptance among the reps and then Senate. And it may not be this with this group of coming up in the midterms, but as Jerome made a point, companies are from Canada coming into Michigan to invest for a reason. Okay, and so that's the vision. Know your client. What's the vision? What's the goal? And really, I think there's a lot of development there.
And interestingly enough, I know that, or I believe that Canada is one of the only countries that now exports internationally already. So I believe that they have international exports to, like give your Denmarks and Amsterdams. They export to countries in Europe. And I know that a lot of that is off a universal GMP that they have, right? So when you start importing things in the other countries, they're going to say, how do I know this product is safe? Before cannabis can be, sent state to state, I'm sure the FDA or, will get those GMP practices in, and that's going to be a whole nother level of federal regulatory overlay that says before this leaves your state and enters your neighboring state, here's how your facility must be run. So again, these things all come with great possibility, and it just generates opportunity for attorneys that can, let these people who are experts at one thing know that with that, there are laws to how to do it all.
Professor Barnheiser, do you have any questions on legal careers? Because I know I get that in my classes and we talk about that extensively. Anything coming up on, do we have attendees that have questions about that?
I think
future.
This is a situation where great minds are thinking alike. When I'm on this panel, looking at the three of you, I'm seeing people who have basically created your careers. You've been entrepreneurial and aggressive in designing the type of work that you want to practice. Do you have any advice for any JD students who are thinking, hey, I want to do weed law, I want to do marijuana law, I want to do cannabis law, but they're still at the stage of, I know it's out there, but how do I get involved? How do I prepare myself?
So I'll pop in on this one. The irony is, if you ask me, when I was sitting in that same seat as a law student right now, when I got asked that question later, when I was able to, or when I met people, my passion was entertainment and sports law. That's what I want to do. And similarly, it wouldn't have said cannabis law. I mean, candidly, I never even consumed most of my life when talking high school, undergrad, law school, professional life, just not my thing, right? The irony is that once I got exposed to the industry, I understood more of that sort of scientific approach to it all, opened my eyes in a different way. But what I would have said again was entertainment law, very niche area. And what got told to me, which I concurred with then, I concur with respect to thinking about I want to do weed law, is learn to become a good lawyer. Our body of law is not that huge, to be candid, right? It's pretty tiny when you think about other things out there. People said the same say about entertainment and sports law. Really, those are amalgamations of different disciplines, right? They create sort of this sub-discipline. Similar thing in cannabis, but we do have some statutory regimes, right? Normally at certain state levels and then local municipal levels, and eventually maybe some federal regime that's going to come our way soon. But again, think about the interpretation of said statute. Well, statutes is one thing, but the interpretation, the actual case law, very limited, right? And a lot of it not mandatory. It's persuasive. This city did that happened over in that county over there. So frankly, you can become an expert in cannabis law, like the body of law, which is pretty slim, quite quickly, which is why I doubled down on that point to learn how to become a good lawyer. I am a corporate generalist, and my path to cannabis is very unique in that I started at Silk Stocking Law Firm, Dickens Wright alum, along with Myles, and spent my time there. Then I went multi-industry and in-house roles, where I eventually became a corporate generalist. I was starting that way as outside counsel. I just didn't want to do just litigation. I like cookies, cake, and ice cream on the same plate, right? So give me a little bit of this, a little of that, a little corporate law, a little IP. And so I had this multifaceted approach that I then carried into different industries, but ones I wasn't candidly super passionate about. Ironically, again, wasn't passionate about weed, didn't even do it, right? But I said, hey, what I was passionate about was the social equity part, especially because of the fact that social equity has to be attacked from different angles. I didn't share that earlier. It takes the regulator, which is our now CRA, we've talked about and David shared a ton about, and Myles talked to every day. We talked about what the legislature does when they create laws, and those laws inherently versus say being inherently discriminatory, now they're going to be inherently helpful to people that were discriminated against, right? The people that were over criminalized. But then it also takes us, private industry. So that was my opportunity to say, you know what, that's what I'm passionate about. A chance to make change. And I'd love the opportunity to do that. And I've loved, every day of so being in this role for the last year and a half. But when you ask me what I do every day, employment law, IP, contracts, commercial litigation, dispute resolution. I mean, that's corporate generalist approach that I've had for many years. I still have, and I'll pass the mic, but I'll close with this. I also teach that same class at Wayne State Law School, right? I'm an adjunct professor there. And it's the corporate counsel externship program. And what I love is that best part we get from class is when my students share dialogue and we have this open forum and we just talk about our week and what happened when they were externing a legal department of a different company, different industry. And when they see their little light bulbs turn on, like, wait, you do that too over there? I thought that was that's a thing over here, or that's distinct about what's going on over there. All of that is really, that's the type of law that you're going to practice. So some of you though, and Myles, I mean, you may jump this too, is that you may take a more disciplined approach too. So you don't have to be a generalist, but as long as you become a good lawyer, everything else is going to open up for you from there.
Yeah, in a way, I would say litigation generalist. I was a corporate litigation associate that was always looking for something to be interested in and passionate about at a firm with a million different practice groups. And actually, it wasn't even a thing when I graduated. And I graduated in 2017. There was no cannabis class. I think I did a 50-state survey as a summer associate. And I was like, okay, kind of had that experience of like, well, 50-state surveys aren't fun, but I was learning about a new area of law. And as it got traction in the firm that I was with at the time, it became almost like a gold rush of an entire new area of law that could generate brand new multi-million-dollar clients because it wasn't a thing, right? If you could get in the industrial boom and sign forward to a deal as a partner at a law firm before the industry was what it is now, that's what's happening at these law firms with cannabis. You can go to a mid-sized firm or a small firm or a large firm and say, hey, you are missing, you have a blind spot for a huge opportunity. And like Rome's saying, with the actual rules being quite thin, you can become a master in a year's time and kind of become an expert in a field of law that, some companies are entirely avoiding, or, put yourself out there, be social and kind of go try to bring in those clients yourself and say, hey, I have value to add by being a good lawyer and I understand what your business does. So in that way, you're taking your admin law and reading these statutes, you're understanding how to interpret, argue in front of municipalities, and read your laws as they're written and arguing on behalf of your client. That's kind of how it goes. So being a good cannabis attorney is being a good lawyer in general, and applying what you're good at and what you're passionate about to cannabis.
I would echo the points that I think were shared in the chat that Matthew might have shared to everyone. Agreed. Part of becoming a good lawyer, also learn the complementary disciplines that your clients are likely to have. David said it earlier, know your client. A lot of, let's say you represent a developer like us. Well, a lot of times they're a new entity, right? So they're going to have what new companies things and new companies deal with, right? But then there's other things that are just across the board, zoning law, as David shared earlier. So great comments from that, Matthew. I agree. There are certain disciplines that are complementary in substantive areas.
From my perspective, 14 years as a municipal attorney and education attorney representing cities, villages, townships, and public schools and colleges. So when we saw the laws change in 2008 for the medical marijuana, I knew that this was going to be a game changer in Michigan. So really dove into that law, what that means. And then when we started seeing amendment to that, and then when we seen the Public Act 281 of 2016, with those licenses, those commercial licenses for, the grower, processor, provisioning center, transporter, testing labs. I said, only a matter of time before that goes recreational, right? 2 years later with Martma. So, from my municipal point of view, my practice, and we represent, more than 10 municipalities statewide. It is very busy with helping these jurisdictions, one, accept the industry, right? We're starting to see kind of a turnover in elected officials that are, gotten away from the reefer madness type of mentality to an acceptance, and for the reasons we talked about tonight, and then helping their planning commissions, their elected officials, their staff, how do you deal with this industry if you want this? And it's working with the developers, right, on zoning. And then sometimes it's the taxation from the developer's standpoint, it's the taxation for how they're going to deal with, with the taxation issues. From our standpoint, we're dealing with some things with, the property taxation of those types of issues. And then, for our next section, the whole area of labor and employment law is so big. Sorry, folks, we couldn't get that in, but you touched on it with drug testing. And what we hear is, hey, if it's legal, why can't we use it? Well, you can't come to work, with a 6-pack in your back pocket, but yet, how do we reconcile these things? And one of the things I focus on with my clients is it's about work performance more than a red line test. And so, that's a huge changing landscape of, human resource law, labor and employment law in this field, because we've seen exponentially the use increase. And, you've heard the phrase, if you build it, they will come. If you build more and have more retail, there's probably going to be more use. How do we deal with that in the workplace? And so, next phase, next seminar, right? But when we look at this is a huge area of law that's going to be affected as well, because the numbers will increase. I think some statistics out there was like, in the last 30 days, 2 million people in Michigan have used cannabis. Have you gentlemen read that report too? I'm not going to dispute it. I don't know. I didn't do the study on it. But
I didn't read that report. But I shared a statistic literally today that was done and talked about the number of, I think it was the CDC statistic. I think it might have been, or something of that like, that said that 20% of Americans reported in 2019 using that year.
Yeah.
So it's
in 2019, right? 2019.
20 right. and 3 years in our industry, 6 months is a lifetime, right? So 3 years, you can imagine how different. Now you've got cities that come online like, there's a lot of weed over there, and that's it. The ones you never thought would come around, right? Because they're looking at that appropriations report going, whoa, $56,000 each license. Okay, yeah, I don't hate weed that much.
That's a great point, Jerome. And it just came out too, right? March 24th, and we all got the same email, and we're like, okay, well, we're getting that in there on 420, right? Because that is truly a game changer. I've got clients going, well, you know what, should we? Oh, got that email, right? So it's something that is developing rapidly. You try to build a PowerPoint, or you try to do a presentation, you better check your sources within the last week, because, and that's the exciting part about this industry, by the way. We talk about legal jobs and things like that. I really don't think we've really scratched the surface with how large the industry is going to be in Michigan and nationwide. And so that's why I encourage my students, hey, take a look at the map, take a look at, what you want to do in this industry. Do you want to be on the developer working with the companies? Do you want to be on the regulation, the government regulation? There's still areas on criminal defense because of the driving laws, that's significant, right? And, if you're doing certain things over certain amounts, there's still that prosecution area as well. And let's not discount the fact that, many people with their Juris Doctor don't necessarily practice law, but they are moving into high levels of management positions out there as well. And, when you look at, what can I do with my JD? Well, just look up, okay, because the sky's the limit. It's your imagination. It's your degree to use. And that, quite frankly, that's one of the reasons why I got a JD, was to have, more choices.
All right. Well, I know you all heard that chime. It just went off. It's 8:06 now, and I want to keep going, but I know that we have to conclude tonight's talk out of respect for your time and the time of our presenters. There is so much more to talk about in the area of cannabis law. I'm hoping to be able to invite our presenters back for another program next semester. A sincere thank you to our speakers. I loved seeing you all again. I loved working with you. We're looking for more installments in this lecture series, so keep an eye out for more timely conversations with our faculty and alumni experts. Please do keep in touch. Have a great night, and go green.
Jerome and Myles, we're going to hook up again, okay?
We're
You're
doing
alumni. You're tied in, man. We got something going this fall. We're going to do it, right?
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care. Thank you.